Snowstorms had swallowed the town of Winter Hollow, turning every roof into a coffin-white slab and every street into a maze of ice, but none of that cold compared to the chill in the hearts of the townsfolk gathered inside the crumbling chapel that morning, their breaths trembling in the air like ghosts as they watched the bound girl kneeling beneath the hanging rope. Her green dress was torn, smeared with mud and dried blood, her braids loose and eyes wide with hunger so deep it made even the toughest cowhands look away, and yet the mayor had declared her guilty of stealing a single loaf of bread from the town bakery, a loaf she had clutched to her chest while shivering behind the stables, whispering, "I'm sorry, Mama. I'll eat slow." Before they dragged her away, the preacher, an old white-bearded man with shaking hands, opened his thick leather Bible but couldn't even read the first verse because every time he looked at her thin arms and bruised face, his voice cracked like frozen timber, while the townsfolk murmured among themselves, some disgusted by the mayor's cruelty, others too afraid to speak against him, for he ruled Winter Hollow with fear, taxes, and the sheriff in his pocket. Outside, the wind howled like wolves tearing at the sky, and with every gust the chapel door rattled as if something, or someone, was fighting to come in, but the mayor ignored it, raising his hand to silence the crowd, shouting that the stolen bread had been the last straw, that lawbreakers must be made an example of, and the girl, whose name was Leora, shut her eyes tight as tears mixed with the snowflakes landing on her cheeks, whispering a silent prayer not for her life, but for her little brother waiting in the abandoned barn outside town, starving and alone. The rope swung above her like a silent serpent ready to strike when suddenly the chapel doors blasted open with a thunderous crack, spilling a whirl of snow inside as every candle flickered violently and every gasp froze in the air. There stood the widowed rancher, Caleb Rowan, tall and broad-shouldered, his long coat dusted with snow, his hat low over eyes sharpened by grief and steel, for he had buried his wife only 6 months earlier and since then had lived alone on the outskirts of Winter Hollow, keeping to himself except when he rode into town for supplies, and though he rarely spoke, his presence always felt like a storm rolling in across empty plains. Now, panting from the ride, he stepped forward, boots thudding across the chapel floor, ignoring every shout telling him to stop, his voice cutting through the room like a blade as he demanded to know what they were doing. What kind of town hangs a starving girl for taking bread? And the mayor, red-faced and shaking, ordered the sheriff to remove him, but the sheriff, who had seen Caleb fight off 2 bandits with nothing but a broken lantern the year before, took one look at him and pretended not to hear. Caleb's gaze locked onto Leora, her arms tied painfully behind her, her knee bleeding from where she had fallen struggling, and something inside him twisted, a memory of his late wife. Pale and hungry during the winter the fever took her, whispering with the last of her breath, "Caleb, don't let anyone starve alone." Before anyone could stop him, Caleb strode forward, grabbed the hanging rope, and with one fierce pull of his hunting knife sliced it clean, letting the loop fall harmlessly beside her as the crowd gasped, and the preacher nearly dropped his Bible while Leora stared up in disbelief, not understanding how death had turned into a miracle in a single breath. The mayor roared that Caleb had broken the law, but Caleb snapped back that the law had broken the town long before he arrived, and he lifted Leora gently, untied her wrists with fingers surprisingly soft for a man who had built an entire ranch with his bare hands, then knelt to meet her eye level, pulling a wrapped piece of fresh bread from his coat pocket, his own breakfast, and placed it carefully into her trembling hands, saying the words that silenced the entire chapel, "Eat first, the rest we'll deal with after." And Leora, choking with emotion, took the tiniest bite, closing her eyes as the warmth filled her empty stomach, while Caleb picked her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence, some ashamed, some inspired, as Caleb carried her toward the open doors, snow blowing around them like a curtain parting for justice, and though the mayor screamed that Caleb would pay, that Winter Hollow would not tolerate rebellion, Caleb didn't slow down, didn't look back. He simply muttered, "Then you'll have to come to my land to take her," knowing no one dared step foot there without invitation. As they stepped into the storm, Leora fainted against his chest from exhaustion, and Caleb tightened his hold, fully aware he had just started a war he could not walk away from, but something in his heart, something long dormant since his wife's death, whispered that saving this girl was the first thing that felt right in months. Behind him, angry voices erupted inside the chapel, but others, braver men and women, began whispering that Caleb was right, that mercy was not weakness, and that perhaps Winter Hollow needed a new kind of law. The blizzard roared as Caleb placed Leora gently onto his horse, wrapped her in his coat, and turned toward the distant silhouette of his ranch, knowing that this was only the beginning, that hunger was not the only thing threatening the girl's life, and that the mayor would not rest until she was dragged back. But Caleb Rowan, widowed, wounded, and weary, would risk everything to protect her, even if it meant facing the entire town alone. And as he rode into the whitewashed distance, Leora finally whispered a tiny, fragile "thank you," unaware that her rescue had just set in motion the most dangerous storm Winter Hollow had ever seen, and the most unexpected bond between two lives broken in different ways yet destined to change each other forever. So viewers, if you want to see how Caleb fights the town, what secrets Leora reveals, and how this story twists deeper into danger and redemption. The storm clawed at Caleb Rowan as he rode through the blinding snow, every gust slicing across his face like frozen knives, but he kept one arm wrapped tightly around Leora to shield her from the cold, knowing she was far too weak to endure another hour in this weather. And when his ranch finally appeared through the swirling white, a lonely cabin perched against the dark line of pines, smoke rising faintly from its chimney, he exhaled with relief he didn't even realize he'd been holding. As he lifted Leora from the saddle, he felt the tremor in her body, not just from cold but from fear, the kind that lodges deep in the bones after too many nights spent hiding from the world. And when he carried her inside, the warmth of the fireplace wrapped around them like an embrace Leora had forgotten the feeling of, her eyes fluttering open to the scent of burning pine and wool blankets. Caleb set her gently on the couch, stoking the fire with practiced hands, and she watched him quietly, trying to understand why a stranger would risk everything for her when the town she had lived in her whole life had been ready to kill her without hesitation. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but tinged with something heavy, grief, maybe, as he asked her how she'd ended up stealing bread, and Leora hesitated, fingers twisting around the blanket until she finally whispered the truth, that she had lost her parents to fever the same winter Caleb lost his wife, that she and her little brother Eli had been living in an abandoned barn outside town, that she had sold everything, her mother's necklace, her father's boots, until there was nothing left, and when Eli collapsed from hunger 2 days ago, she had no choice but to steal. Her words spilled out in shaking pieces, and Caleb listened without interrupting, his eyes darkening not with judgment but with the kind of sorrow only someone who has buried love can understand. When she finished, he knelt beside her, telling her softly that she was safe now, that she would not be dragged back to that chapel as long as he stood breathing. But Leora shook her head desperately, insisting that she could not stay, that the mayor would come for her, and worse, they might hurt Eli if they thought he was helping her hide. Caleb rose without a word, walked to the corner of the cabin, and returned with his coat and gloves, saying only, "Show me where he is," and before Leora could protest, he wrapped her up again and lifted her onto the horse, riding back into the storm toward the barn she described. By the time they arrived, the roof was sagging under a thick layer of snow, and inside they found Eli curled in a pile of straw, pale and barely conscious, eyes flickering open at the sound of his sister's voice. And Caleb didn't waste a second, scooping the boy into his arms and pressing his own coat around him, telling Leora to stay close because the boy needed heat, fast. Back at the ranch, Caleb worked with quiet urgency, heating broth, placing warm stones near Eli's feet, and wrapping him in every blanket he had, while Leora watched with eyes full of tears she hadn't been able to shed in days, whispering that she wished she could repay him. But Caleb only shook his head, telling her gently that some things weren't meant to be repaid, only passed forward when the time came. For a brief moment, warmth settled over the cabin like a fragile peace, but it shattered the instant hoofs thundered in the distance, hard, fast, and many. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he moved instinctively to the window, spotting torchlight weaving through the storm like fiery serpents, the mayor's men emerging from the trees, rifles glinting under the snow. Far more than Caleb expected this soon. Leora's breath caught in her throat as she clutched her brother, whispering that she couldn't let Caleb get hurt because of her, but Caleb steadied her shoulders, his voice low yet resolute as he told her that once he stepped forward to save her life, he had accepted whatever storm followed, and he wouldn't back down now. He blew out the lanterns, moved quietly through the room, taking down the rifle mounted above the fireplace, checking the mechanism with the ease of a man who'd worked cattle in bandit country for years, then turned toward the door just as fists pounded against it, the mayor shouting through the wood that Caleb Rowan was harboring a criminal and would be arrested for obstructing justice unless he handed the girl over immediately. Caleb's heartbeat thudded steady and slow in his chest, the rhythm of a man who had faced loss, danger, and loneliness so many times he no longer feared them, and he opened the door just enough to step outside, snow hitting his coat like shards of glass while the torches cast flickering shadows across his stern face. The mayor, wrapped in his heavy fur, snarled that Caleb had no right to interfere with town law, but Caleb answered calmly that law without mercy wasn't justice, it was cruelty, and that no child would hang while he lived. Rifles lifted toward him, but before the sheriff could bark an order, a different voice rang out from the darkness behind the mayor's men, one of the townsfolk from the chapel, a middle-aged woman with trembling hands who had followed the group silently, now stepping forward to say she too believed the punishment had been wrong. Another man spoke next, then another, until murmurs spread among the crowd like sparks in dry brush, people realizing that maybe, just maybe, the widowed rancher wasn't the rebel here, but the only one brave enough to do what they all knew was right. The mayor tried to silence them, shouting that fear kept a town alive, that mercy made people weak, but the sheriff, who had been watching Caleb closely, finally lowered his rifle and said quietly, "No more children dying for bread," a statement that cracked the mayor's power like thin ice under heavy weight. Caleb didn't smile, but something eased in his expression as he stepped back, allowing the moment to shift, and Leora, watching from the window with Eli in her arms, felt the impossible hope stir inside her chest. The mayor, red with rage, fled on horseback, vowing that Winter Hollow hadn't seen the last of him, but his riders hesitated, unsure whether to follow a tyrant or stand with their neighbors, and slowly the group dissolved, leaving the ranch quiet once more. Inside the cabin, Caleb returned to find Leora still trembling, not from fear now but from relief so overwhelming it felt unreal, and when she whispered, "Why did you fight for me?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Because someone once fought to keep my world alive, and I wasn't able to save her. I won't fail again," his voice cracking with the grief of a man who had carried loneliness too long. As the fire crackled beside them and Eli breathed softly under his blankets, Leora felt her world shift for the first time, realizing that this rancher who walked like a storm and spoke like a prayer might be the first safe place she had known in years. And if you want to know what the mayor plans next, how Caleb protects Leora and Eli, and what secret Leora will reveal that changes everything, then